Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome everyone to another edition or episode of the Ummatics Colloquium. Today we are honored. It is an honor and a pleasure to have with us today Dr. Farid Hafez, all the way from the United States. I believe you're in currently. So we look forward in this episode to really get into an in-depth discussion about Farid's most recent publication, his book, published just this year, so it's fresh off the press, about governing Islam in Austria and Germany, from the colonial past to the present. The format for today's discussion is very straightforward. We want to leave maximum time for discussion. I will give a brief introduction, then I will pass on the digital mic to Farid to present an overview of his book in about 20 minutes. And then we'll get into the interview style discussion, in which we have a lot of time to discuss various elements and various aspects of the book, its arguments, its implications, and so on and so forth, inshallah. I would like to introduce Dr. Farid. So Dr. Farid Hafez is currently at William & Mary. He's an assistant teaching professor of international relations. He earned his PhD in political science from the University of Vienna in 2009. Since then, he has had teaching and research at the University of Salzburg, but also at Williams College in the US. And in 2017, he had been a Fulbright professor at the University of California Center for Race and Gender Studies. And since then, he has also been a non-resident senior researcher at the Georgetown University's The Bridge Initiative. He has over 150 academic publications. He has been the founding editor of the German English Islamophobia Studies Yearbook. That's a very important publication, I should note. He's also been the co-editor of the European Islamophobia Report, another very important publication. In 2015, he received the Bruno Kreisky Award for the Political Book of the Year for his anthology Islamophobia in Austria. And he has a number of books published, Politicizing Islam in Austria, The Far-Right Impact in the 21st Century, published by, co-authored with Reinhard Heinisch, I think, Rutgers University Press in 2024. And of course, today's work, which is the focus or the object of today's discussion, is his 2026 work published by Oxford University Press, Governing Islam in Austria and Germany from Colonial Times to the Present, which I won't give an overview of right now because I think that Dr. Farid will do a better job of that. So I will pass on the mic to him to give us an overview of his book in about 20 minutes, more or less, and then we will revert to a discussion.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the invitation and the interest in the book. I'm happy to share some of my thoughts here with a rather global audience that usually, as I understand, convenes digitally. But also happy to be at the conference in July this year in Bosnia and Sarajevo, which in effect is also one of the places that I write about in the very book that I just published, given that the Austro-Hungarians colonized Bosnia. And that's the very place where they learned all of their colonial administrative experience, where they gained it and then translated it later on into the Nazi era and the post-colonial contemporary. All right, so I would like to share my slides here, and would like to start basically with kind of where I come from, for listeners and readers to better understand. Othman Badr, you already said, I'm a political scientist by training. This is kind of my point of departure, where I raise the questions that I do. And I would like to share here one of probably the most quoted works in political science that tries to explain what different authors have called by different names like the accommodation of Islam, the governance of Islam, bureaucratization of Islam, management of Islam, and so on and so forth. What is interesting with this book by two other fellow poli-sci colleagues in their comparative analysis of Britain, France, and Germany is that they suggest understanding the governance of Islam through a historical lens, which is something that I'm actually very sympathetic to. I think that makes a lot of sense. But what this very work is not able to achieve is giving an explanation of why, in fact, the way of how those states in those three countries govern Muslims differs from the way they govern other religions. So they speak about like broader structures, but are lacking the ability to fully grasp the discriminatory aspects, which is also why you find a lot of poli-sci literature which would rather situate the contemporary governance of Islam in a much more shorter period of time. A lot of people are going back to the beginning of the global war on terror, 25 years back. Others, maybe, if they look at the whole issue for a little bit longer, they might gonna go back to 1945 or the Cold War era. But I felt like there is a need to go even beyond that. And we can go in the discussion, maybe speak a bit also about, some of the aspects of what triggered my interest in that kind of very specific colonial era. There is indeed one other publication by a couple of Dutch scholars, Colonial and Post-Colonial Governance of Islam, Continuities and Ruptures, which to an extent builds the basis of what I'm doing here. But I would say I go way beyond that in terms of including specifically questions of race and racialization. But also another thing that this book differs from the book that I did is that it tries to understand first and foremost the post-colonial the colonial legacy of the governance of Islam in those territories that were colonized, that were occupied by European empires. What I do is something else. What I do is try to understand how is the experience that the German Kaiserreich and the Austro-Hungarian Empire gain in their colonial times, how does that go back to the motherland? How does that go back to the center post 1945? So it's a different interest that I have in terms of the traveling of those experiences. So what I offer in a way is to bring together a couple of different literatures: poli-sci, history, post-colonial, decolonial theory, sociology. And I would like just to briefly talk about a couple of things that I do here. And that's kind of how I open up the book, and I think also gives you a good idea about what the book tries to do. So I start with 3 examples from 3 different polities or 3 different regions. The first example that I give is from somebody who is the dual finance minister of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Benjamin von Kallay, himself a Hungarian aristocrat. And he's kind of like from 1882, which is 4 years after the Austro-Hungarians took control over Bosnia, which up until then was still a vilayet of the Ottoman Empire. After it was handed over to them by the Berlin Congress, 4 years later, Benjamin von Kallay came into the picture. And he was, you could say, the most important colonial actor in regards to Bosnia. And, Bosnia is also in a way special because it's a continental colony. It's not an overseas colony in Africa or Asia. It's kind of like nearby. So a letter from Vienna to Sarajevo took 1 to 2 days, right? Very much different to the Germans, where a letter from Berlin to Zanzibar took 1 to 2 months, right? So this allowed Benjamin von Kallay to be really able to micromanage what was going on in Bosnia. And one of the wealth of the archives that I analyzed was also his exchange of letters to the governor in Bosnia, as well as to the district officers. So what I show you here is something that he wrote in 1900, where he speaks about the case of Bosnia. The whole book is dedicated to understanding Bosnia. And what he says here is, I quote, "Before our eyes, an interesting and in terms of its extent, a significant part of the great world problem is taking place, whether and how it is possible to integrate the Mohammedan view of life into the framework of modern, loyal progress in such a way that the Mohammedan element also becomes an equal factor or the same." So in other words, what he tries to understand is how can we make use the Bosnian colonial subject for the interests of the Austro-Hungarian Empire? How can we make them part of this idea of a modernity project in which it could be a useful tool? And one of the things that astonished me most, because I was very much aware of, the historical literature about Bosnia from Austrian historians, who were largely not mentioning race nowhere. But when you read this book of him, it's like race is everywhere. And one of the ways of how he understood the Bosnians was by framing them as an Oriental race, a Turkic Mohammedan Weltanschauung, which is on the one hand seeing the Bosnians in racial terms as still being part of the Ottoman Empire, being part of the Oriental race, and almost identifying that race with a religion. So in that sense, a very strong conflation of what race and religion means. Fast forward 130 years later, we have Sebastian Kurz, short-time chancellor in Austria, who was also head of the conservative Christian democratic kind of a center-right political party. And one of the things that he did was establish an Islam Act in 2015, which would be a new act that would substitute the Islam Act of 1912 from the times of the Habsburg monarchy. And I won't go too much into the details here, but there's a lot of discussions and critique that has been uttered around the Islam Act of 2015. I just want to bring to the fore one important aspect in our debate here, which is that they legitimized the Islam Act by saying we want to ban foreign funding for Muslim associations. And this was also very important back then, something similar in when the Austro-Hungarians came into Bosnia, because one of the highest priorities for them was to cut off all the connections between the Sheikhul Islam in the Ottoman Empire and the Bosnian Muslim community, to create basically a new Muslim Bosnian religious institution, which is still around with the Reisul Ulema and those authorities. So the way Sebastian Kurz defended the necessity for the Islam Act was by drawing on the idea that we want to create an Islam of Austrian imprint, Islam österreichische Prägung, and that would counteract the not so good Muslims, which is framed as political Islam, an alleged transnational threat to Austrian sovereignty. All right, so we have here the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Second Republic of Austria, a democratic republic. The next example is from Germany. We have in 1910, Karl Heinrich Becker. Everybody who does Islamic studies knows him, or at least his institutions. Der Islam is one of the flagship Islamic studies journals that was established by him. He was the chair of the Colonial Institute of Hamburg, which later became the University of Hamburg. Very much involved not only in scholarship, but as kind of what I would call applied Islamic studies in the service of the colonial empire. And during the German Colonial Congress, which there were many of, in 1910, he said, the Islam question Islamfrage, which is very close to how Germans would also call the Judenfrage, the Jewish question, is a colonial political problem of utmost importance, he argues. Continuing to say, the existence of the Islamfrage presumes the existence of a conscious Islampolitik on behalf of the administration. The government is aware of this big and difficult duty. So as you can also see here, this is basically where I got the whole notion of Islampolitik from. It was not my invention. It's something that Karl-Heinrich Becker came up with. It's a notion that in German language is still around when you look into some of the legal and poli-sci scholarship, but primarily the legal scholarship. So what is interesting here is that he kind of clearly formulates everything that I needed in order to understand what was the rationale for these colonial governors, how to approach Muslims in the colonial territories, right? Clearly framing the so-called Islam question as a colonial political problem, but also saying that in order to solve this problem, the state has to get into the game. And what he has to come up with is a very conscious, very deliberate process of thinking about how to govern Muslims. Fast forward again, almost 100 years later, this is a quote from, or a reference to the German Minister of Interior back then, Wolfgang Schäuble, also from the Christian Democratic Union, centrist right party in Germany, that established what came to be known and is still around as an institution, the so-called Deutsche Islamkonferenz, the German Islam Conference. What this whole conference was all about was, in terms of its legitimization in the public, was that they said, we want to create the German imam. All right. Again, if you look back into the German colonial era, one of the things that they were speaking about was the construction of the Kaiserlich Deutsche Muwallim. Muwallim is the Swahili word for the scholar, Muallim in the Arabic. And Kaiserlich German would be like the Kaiser's German kind of ideal imam for the German colonial empire. So the German Islam Conference should again be here to domesticate, in other words, religious Muslim authorities in the face of the German Republic. And what happened from there on was also an attempt to, and again, this has been since 2009-10, a great effort where a lot of human and financial resources have been put in to create in German state universities, so-called Islamic theological departments or institutes, in order to train a new generation of German Muslims to nurture a specific understanding of Muslim subjectivity that is, at the end of the day, standing as a supporter of the German state's agendas. Now, the third example, with which I will end my intro, is from a time that was shared by both Austria and Germany, which is the Nazi Empire. In the Nazi Empire in 1942, Adolf Hitler, who obviously, being the racial state, representing a racial state, was not necessarily very fond of Semites. They came up in 1942 with what he would call the positive Musulmanenpolitik, positive Muslim policy, which was the idea which emerged very late into the war, because there was a necessity and the need to mobilize new soldiers for the war fronts, especially in the Caucasus as well as in the Balkans, where these efforts materialized first and foremost in establishing religious educational institutions in order to train the new future Muslim soldiers. That was, again, even in terms of the genealogy, in terms of the personnel that was involved in thinking about this positive Musulmanenpolitik, was drawing on the scholars and the bureaucrats that emerged during the end of the German Kaiserreich. Von Oppenheim is one of the famous scholars who was heavily involved in the Islampolitik during World War I. And that's something where we see personal continuity, but also the attempt to basically use Islamic authorities for their own political work that they would do. There is one very interesting aspect, and that's the last thing I'll say here. A lot of people might be familiar with Hajj Amin Hussein as the Mufti of Jerusalem, who was actually a British invention, in the way that when the British took over Palestine, there were four scholars representing the four different madhahib, schools of thought, legal schools of thought. And one of the things that they did was saying, well, look at the Austrians, how they are doing it. They only have one Reisul Ulema. So that's the way we should do it. So explicitly referencing the Austrians and their experience in Bosnia, saying, okay, let's establish just one mufti. And that was also one of the religious leaders that was then mobilized by the Nazi Empire for their war propaganda to convince Muslims to fight on their side against the Russians, the French, and the British, who at the very same time were very much doing the very same thing, which is creating muftiyats that would serve their state structures. Now, what does that mean if we have so many different political regimes, right? I'm speaking here of monarchies, colonial empires. I'm speaking of a totalitarian state, and I'm speaking of democratic republics. So we have vastly different political regimes in place. And also, we can go into that a bit more deeper later on. Austria and Bosnia are actually very, very different from each other in terms of their structures of their colonial empires. So given all these differences, why is there so much similarity? And that's kind of like the question that I raise. And what I try to suggest is we can better understand the contemporary by looking back into the colonial era. And what I try to do throughout the book is basically show all these continuities and a lot of similarities, but also some of the differences that are there. Okay, and I'll leave it to you at this point. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Very interesting, very instructive. Okay, let's jump into unpack some of this. I might start by saying the way I read the introduction of the book, and you gave another book talk. So based on my research, what I understood in terms of kind of like the core argument of the book, is something along the lines of that the way Austria and Germany govern and regulate Islam today is not a new response to terrorism or migration, as it is said to be, usually by the state, by the right wing, by many people, sometimes popularly believed to be. It's not just about political control or security policy, but in fact, it turns out to be a continuation of patterns first developed during the colonial periods, their respective colonial periods, in which racialization of Muslims as inferior plays a key role. So there's both this point about continuity, governance of Islam, regulation, disciplining, and then there's this element of racialization, which is key as well. And perhaps even more broadly, obviously you're working with Austria and Germany, but a lot of the examples that you were giving, I was noting comparisons with France, with in some respects Britain, Australia. I'm based in Australia, which is only 2 letters away from Austria. I know that there was a time here where Australian imams was part of government policy. So perhaps more broadly, European states or Western states have repeatedly tried to create bureaucratic structures and educational programs that the aim of which is to produce acceptable, loyal Muslims while marginalizing or suppressing those that don't comply. That's the kind of argument that I'm hearing from this book. which is extremely valuable, and particularly in the detail, the depth that you presented in the book, the history, the empirical work. The first question I would ask you is that an accurate summary? And taken us through 3 examples. How would you articulate
Yeah,
what we learned from the book? What's the core argument?
I think you certainly got it. That's a
Okay.
great summary. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Maybe what I would add is, obviously, in terms of my theoretical approach that I use here, is the coming from a kind of a decolonial critique of a lot of the current policy literature. It's also the argument that, if my assumption is that coloniality is still an ongoing process, it is just something that is here, the coloniality of power. That's how I developed this idea of the coloniality of Islampolitik. So the past is never gone. The past is still present, right? And that's kind of like the main argument that I make, and how I try to make use of decolonial intervention for understanding very specific bureaucratic administrative policies that are in place. Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
And maybe one thing to add, because one of the things you mentioned is, like, you were reminded of examples of France, of examples of Britain, and certainly that is the case. I mean, maybe as something as a background story. Initially, I did not intend to write this book as such. Initially, I had prepared a research grant, including a couple of other countries as well, as a collective research project. But given that that was for the ERC, the European Research Council, and given that you have to have like 5 supportive anonymous reviewers agreeing with your and then supporting your project, in my case, it was only 4 out of 5 who supported it, and one basically said Austria never had a colony, and that was the end of the game. And therefore, what I did was saying, okay, now I moved to the United States, no more here, no ERCs. Like, what should I do out of this, right? So I came to write this book about 2 countries which I'm most familiar with, and also in terms of its languages, capable of doing this kind of work that I did. And the argument, nevertheless, is, and that's kind of the working hypothesis, is this is true for all the former empires. It's not unique to Austria and Germany. But I think what is interesting is, obviously, when you usually think about colonies, you don't think about Austria, right? And more so maybe you think about Germany, but it's also not as popular as France and Britain, or Spain and Portugal. So I think there is a couple of different layers in which such an intervention is important.
No, I was actually going to make that exact point, that before I read the book or heard you summarize it, Austria doesn't come to mind as, a colonial power. Not just from a kind of, it's smaller than the bigger players, but it doesn't come across as, those that engaged in brutal colonization, or that type of a thing. So you're definitely right in that it brings this layer to the front as well. What would you say motivated this book project? And when would you say it started? Because I know there's also the Austrian Islampolitik has impacted yourself personally as well, in what was a very public affair, with raids at your house and so on and so forth. I believe that was 2020.
Right.
Case went through until 2023. I imagine the book project started earlier than that, but talk to us a little bit about the background of how the idea came to you, and how that personal experience
Sure.
perhaps.
Yeah. So the research proposal that I wrote was actually already in 2019. So in that sense, it was predating everything, all of the horrible things that happened thereafter.
Maybe that was the
So
cause of the raid, the research proposal.
yeah, I mean, I interrupted writing the book because of the raid, and I was like, for 2 years, I put this all aside. and I started again, I think, writing in 2021.
Right.
Sitting on my desk and thinking about this whole thing. But actually, the initial starting point of thinking about or along these lines started around 2014-15. And the reason was that the Austrian government, with Sebastian Kurz, whom I mentioned also in this example, he introduced this new Islam Act. So there was a huge public discussion there. And back then I was still in Austria. I was part of also the public, participating in debates, writing op-eds, analysis, etc. And I was sitting with a good friend of mine who is of Bosnian origin. And one of the things he said to me while drinking a coffee or tea back then was, this reminds me, what we are doing reminds me of what the Bosnian Muslim autonomy movement was doing when the Austro-Hungarians were there. So I said, okay, that sounds interesting. I mean, I was obviously aware that the Islam Act was in a way, and I wrote actually an article that was published in 2014 about this, that it was in a way, in geopolitical terms, an attempt to cut off the Bosnians from the Ottomans and to domesticate Muslims. But I did not really look into the, all of the different political actors in the field. I was also not aware of all the different intricacies that were involved back then. But this comment was something that really triggered my interest. And that's where I started thinking more and more about it. And, we did a couple of different other book projects together. But this was kind of like the beginning of it all. And in the meantime, there's also a couple of good publications that appeared in Germany about the German Islampolitik. But that was very much, I would say, focusing on primarily issues around the discourse on Islam. But what I was really interested was like the real hard policies that were implemented and how they were played out, how they played out like in real time. So kind of a slightly different interest in the idea of how to think about coloniality in its manifestation in the polity.
Okay, nice. All right, let's maybe focus in on here a little bit about the conclusions of the research in terms of continuities and discontinuities. Can you speak a little bit more in detail about, let's do the continuities first, but then I think it's also important to get an understanding of the discontinuities. But let's start with the first. What would you say are the main continuities of how Islam was governed in the colonial and post-colonial eras in Austria and Germany?
Yeah, I mean, maybe let's start a little bit chronologically, because I think that's important. When we think about because what I do in the book is look at two policy fields. One is the bureaucratization of Islam, which means like how are Muslim religious institutions established. And the other policy field is religious education, which is very much linked to the first one, but it's more specifically about how to create an educational system that nurtures a specific Muslim subjectivity that, from the colonial perspective, is here to submit to the colonial order. All right. Now, clearly, if we go back into the 1880s, religious institutions meant something different compared to today, right? Because if we go, let's say, to Bosnia, and we say Bosnia was a vilayet, and it was primarily the endowment structures, the waqf structures, that were religious and political at the same time, taking control of the religious institutions meant taking control over the polity. There was no differentiation. That's very different to today, which obviously raises the question, like, why are you so obsessed with controlling Muslim religious institutions if the very meaning of the religious institution has changed so much over 150 years? All right, but let's leave that aside for a moment. But that's maybe to begin with, because in terms of the continuities, it's the continuities of the Islampolitik, although the meaning of the very center of what is at stake is even so different. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Now, the other thing is, and that's where I start with some of the continuities. Let's compare the German Kaiserreich and the Austro-Hungarian Empire here. Clearly, the first thing that both of these empires met was resistance, armed resistance. It was jihad that was waged against the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Kaiserreich. And that is also important to keep in mind. Why? Because in terms of the memory that is here, and that is true not only for Austrian Muslims, but also for Bosnian Muslims. The memory of what the Habsburg Empire actually did is quite positively framed. When you go to Sarajevo, and I'm sure you have been there many times, probably you will see that there is this idea that actually the Austro-Hungarians brought progress, brought modernity, brought kind of a civilization, what they claimed themselves, that was the civilizing mission that all of the empires had, this idea, right? So what is important is the first encounter was resistance. And that is important to keep in mind because one of the Bosnian historians, Hikmet Karčić, said what was a response to that dreadful experience on behalf of the Bosnians was that there was no religious discourse. He calls it the discourse of silence in his work, which means that because they were so shocked to be under Austro-Hungarian rule, they were almost finding themselves without having the ability to know what should we even do now, which is why, according to estimations, between 60,000 and 150,000 Bosnian Muslims actually fled to different parts of the Ottoman Empire throughout those years. And there were always again and again different waves of refugees. So what happened was that, first of all, the resistance was destroyed. The leadership was killed. People were expatriated, expelled from the country, and so on and so forth. Similarly, the German Kaiserreich, what happened was you had, and which is part of the German colonial memory, the so-called, they call it the Arab Revolt or the Slave Revolt, because there were different constituencies in the colonial territory that came together under the leadership of a man whom the German colonialists called Abul Bashir, who was a scholar who was basically one of the, it seems to be one of the main networkers to bring together different groups to resist German colonization. Now, fighting the resistance was step number one. Step number two was that once resistance was squashed, they tried to recreate the religious authorities that were there in the beginning, but make sure that the people who were at the top of the leadership would be loyal to their governments. Now, I'll give you a very informative example here. When Benjamin von Kallay, the dual finance minister of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, came to Bosnia in 1882, he approached a couple of what he called distinguished Mohammedans. That's his formulation. And what he said was, please go to the Kaiser and ask him to grant you the establishment of a Bosnian Muslim church. All right? So they do so. Although for years, the Bosnian Muslims who were nominated by the Sheikhul Islam, there was no central structure, but what you had was that every mufti in every town in Mostar, Travnik, Sarajevo, and so on and so forth, they were given the accreditation by the Sheikhul Islam directly. So it was a very decentralized Muslim religious polity, so to speak. But what they did was like, we want to have a church, and then there's going to be the top guy, the Reisul Ulema, who is existing since then, right? The president of the learned. the leader of the learned. And what they do is, after 3 days, the Kaiser responds to them and says, okay, I'm going to grant you to create this new institution. And then there is a lot of back and forth and fighting and negotiations. Should he still get the Sheikhul Islam's accreditation or not? And I won't go too much into the details here, but there is a lot about a lot of energy that goes into this symbolic question of who is really our religious authority. And the Muslim movement for autonomy basically tries to secure that the Sheikhul Islam has always a say in the game, so that it is not fully disconnected as the Austro-Hungarians want. And to an extent, they also are successful when in 1909, very late, like 21 years after the occupation, they basically also are granted their a relative autonomy in terms of religious and educational affairs. But nevertheless, the same is true for the Germans. When they colonized parts of Togo, Cameroon, and Tanzania, what they do is they try to win over the allegiance of those Muslim elites that were there and that were not part of the resistance, that allowed them to have a more friendlier kind of relationship. And one of the key things that they try to do throughout those years is, for instance, when the ijaza is given from the sheikh to a newly learned student, they interfere into this chain. They say, okay, whoever gets the ijaza, we have to accept it first, right? So there are on multiple levels reappearing attempts to basically have full control over who, at the end of the day, is the main religious authority, which also leads religious Muslim authority to misuse their power. There is a great example, for instance, in Tanzania, where initially the Arabs are seen as the worst, right? Because they are on the coastal lines, they are the ones who are involved in the resistance. Once the Arab notables are being won over, the black Islam becomes the problem, which initially is very much racialized as the good, harmonious, non-violent Islam, but then becomes the violent Islam later on, once there is resistance coming out from the hinterlands. And one of the things that happens is you have some Sufi tarikats there who were organizing and were also including a lot of women, which in and of itself was a symbolic and a political threat to the German colonial enterprise. Why? Because women in general would not politically participate, but also there was this whole issue about why do we want that they are so afraid, basically, of women organizing in the social and political public sphere, which was rebranded as basically something political. So this is just to begin with, squashing resistance, building new institutions. And that is also the case for very much so for the Nazi empire. They tried to create muftiyats with loyalists. Those Muslims who were organized in Austria and Germany in the interwar period, their institutions were either co-opted or new institutions were built, and sometimes it's both of these processes that we are witnessing. And then in the post-war era in Austria and Germany, what happens is that Germany and Austria actually go two very, very different ways. There is this idea of so-called embassy Islam in the Cold War era, which means that European governments outsource the governance of Islam to those embassies where most of the Muslim immigrants are coming from. So basically, they are telling the Turkish embassy, you take care of your Turkish guest workers' religious needs. We obviously gonna trust you, because there is this whole idea of a shared secular understanding that underpins the legitimacy of those two governments, right? Which obviously changed it then later on when the AKP comes into the picture in the mid 2000s. But Austria has a very different take. They established, based on the Islam Act of 1912, the Muslims establish, I have to say, their own Islamic community in 1979. But what is crucial and what is important, for almost 20 years, there is almost no activism on behalf of that institution. Why? Because the guy who becomes its president, who's a former student of the police academy, is basically the man for the Ministry of Interior, because they grant him all the trust, telling him, and when I looked into the archives, that picture was very clear. They were basically saying, this is the man who controls all of those crazy fundamentalist Muslims. As long as he's there, we are fine. And the vast Muslim majority that is organized in this Muslim church, the Islamic Community of Austria, basically wants to get rid of him after a year already. But the state makes sure that he stays in power, basically until he dies in his bed in 1999. Yeah. That's
Okay,
just
wow.
a glimpse. But I feel I could go on and on and on, but I really want to give you some space here.
Okay, now that's very interesting. So some of the continuities are building bureaucratic structures, education programs, squashing resistance, which on the other side of it shows that there's another side to the story which is positive in a way, which is resistance. And if I recall, I think in the introduction you mentioned that there's a dialectical relationship. You don't want to erase Muslim agency in telling this story about how the state tries to co-opt or control Islam. Maybe we can come back to that later. But okay, so those are some of the continuities. What would you say are let's say two discontinuities in how Islam is governed?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things is certainly what I already alluded to in terms of the beginning of post-war Austria and Germany, where you have, in the era of the Cold War, where kind of like on an international level, at least for those countries that are involved in the Western Empire and linked to the Western Empire of the United States, where militancy of Islam becomes an asset again. I mean, that was the case not in the initial colonial era, where militancy was seen as something very bad and obviously threatening the colonial empire, for sure, and it was. But then in World War I, militancy becomes an asset, and you have the German colonial empire approaching the Sheikh al-Islam, hey, issue us a fatwa that all Muslims all around the globe should join jihad against our enemies, and we are on the right side. And again, that reappears in the Nazi era, but it also appears, obviously, with the Soviet Union being fought by the US empire, where Muslims are the good mujahids, right? And in that time, what you can see is that in the Cold War era, the Germans basically outsource Islampolitik, and the Austrians take over and very much use it, but also use this kind of, hey, we are so tolerant, we are the ones who are recognizing a Muslim institution, the only one in Western Europe doing so, outside of the Spanish and later on the Belgians. But that idea was very much like aimed at foreign policy audiences. It was very much a signal sent to the Gulf states, to the MENA region, in a time where also the Social Democrats, the Chancellor Bruno Kreisky was very much involved in welcoming Yasser Arafat, where he was still considered a terrorist. All of that has to do with the neutrality of Austria during the Cold War and the ability to create that space, which was very different to Germany. So in terms of the differences, some of the other differences that are less structural, I mean, clearly, when you mentioned resistance was there first and foremost, but in a very different context, obviously in the colonial period. the resistance that we see in post-war Austria and Germany is very different, right? We're living in democratic polities. Resistance is not armed resistance. Resistance is really, critique. It's part of trying to be part of the civil space of civic society. But again here, and I give a couple of examples, and it also happened to me at one point, right, in 2020. Also, that kind of resistance is being squashed, and what you see is that that the inability, basically, of those nation states to allow for any intervention, interruption of the hegemonic discourse around Islam and Muslims. There is certainly a difference in terms also, I mean, the question of similarities and differences also depends very much on how you try to understand this whole relationship. So I think for a historian who has an idiosyncratic interest in trying to understand the specific moments in time, you could come up with many more differences that I wrote about. Because you will obviously argue, well, let's say the Mufti of Jerusalem, who embraced Nazi empire, is uncomparable, right, with let's say the Reisul Ulema or any president of an Islamic religious authority in Austria or the like. And that's, from an idiosyncratic historical perspective, absolutely right. But me as a social scientist, I was not interested in those kinds of differences. I was interested in the larger patterns, because what I try to understand as a social scientist is like, what are the general rationales that states have, right? So therefore, I would say I certainly foregrounded the similarities, even though these differences are there, and I also do not want to omit them. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I think it would also help to think about alternative lines of argument. Usually, and this is true of any narrative or story, there's always counter narratives or alternative ways of telling the same story. In this case, you already alluded to a couple of these in your presentation by mentioning Fetzer and Sopa, and also Veit Badar and Mohsen and Moore. How would you articulate the counter narratives or the alternative lines of argument, which are different explanations of how Islam is being governed in Europe historically and today?
Yeah.
So
I mean,
let's
look.
start with Fetzer and Sopa. What's their theory?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think which is important, when, for instance, we look at most of the literature that I would say is like, very much thinking through the past 25 years and the global war on terror. The whole idea of securitization, or the whole idea of, seeing Islampolitik basically as a security politics, is something that is not fully wrong, right?
Yes.
Because a great deal of what is happening is based on countering violent extremism policies, de-radicalization policies, whatever name they are given in different contexts. So there is this idea that, yes, this is very much rooted also in the new political formations that we see in the past 20, 30 years. But what I try to say, and let me give you an example here with, de-radicalization or countering violent extremism policies. One of the things that I was so astonished to see was that when the German colonial empire was in Tanzania, Togo, Cameroon, they basically created a whole list of Muslim movements that they wanted to surveil, and that they, regularly reported about, in order to have an understanding like, who is our enemy here. Now, if you take the German case and you say, okay, let's look beyond 9/11 and the global war on terror, you might want to go back into the early moments of post-National Socialist Germany, where the Germans came up with this idea of what they call in German wehrhafte Demokratie, defensive democracy, which is the idea that we can never allow Nazism to happen again, That's why we're actually going to ban all those neo-Nazis and we're going to push them in the underground. All right. So that's a policy that is very much starting with the establishment of the Federal German Republic after National Socialism. And again, you could make that argument, and that is, from a domestic security policy perspective, the way how they look, and that was also predating 9/11, by the way, how they looked at certain Muslim institutions. They actually banned and tried to ban a couple of Muslim institutions that are, some of them more violent, like the Kaplan movement, and some of them embracing kind of like outwardly like the establishment of a caliphate like Hizb ut-Tahrir or so, something like that. But my argument is basically, well, actually, if you go back to the colonial era, that's already where the obsession started with. And the example that I give is because, some people would, counter argue, well, what about Hizb ut-Tahrir? I mean, I think it's still based on a very racialized idea of Islam. Also, these kinds of bans, because at the end of the day, even a movement like Hizb ut-Tahrir is apolitical in a domestic German context, in the sense that it has no interest in creating what they would call an Islamic polity in Germany, right? Is not, has never been. So,
which means it's just an intellectual and political movement in Germany.
Yeah.
And so why is it being banned?
And then I give the example of when the German state started to surveil the Tablighi movement, which is like an even much more apolitical movement, right? It's really about what they would call dawah. That's it. It's reminding Muslims of their Islam. That's it. So, and that is very close to when we had in the German colonial empire the Mecca letter affair. So there was this idea that a letter was written by some sheikh in Mecca. It was distributed all around the German colonial territories, and that was kind of calling Muslims back to the practice of Islam, a reminder. But the way it was interpreted was this was to mobilize Muslims to wage war against the German colonial white man. And that was also very much related to the women who were then mobilized for these Sufi circles, because the argument was they could convince the Askaris, which was the name that was given to the soldiers of the colonial army, which was in German the Schutzmacht, which is a euphemism for basically an army that protects, a protective army, but it was the de facto colonial army that explored, so to speak, the native territories. Most of these Askaris, as they were called by the Germans, from the Arab Askari, were former soldiers of from Sudan and Mozambique, who were initially fighting for the Khedive in Egypt and then later on for the British colonial empire, and were then remobilized by the Germans. So one of the fears was that the women who became more religious would tell the Askaris to exit the army because serving a colonial empire would be against the laws of God, right? So it was these kinds of anxieties that were there that were interpreted as a political threat to the colonial power structures. And I think, again, looking at those continuities and discontinuities in terms of this, if you want to say it's the securitization, my argument is here that we have a lot of predecessing examples where we see a very similar pattern. And I think what is also very helpful here, if we go back into the literature in terms of like the primary evidence that I found, is that race is so central to this whole debate. And that is oftentimes, I would say, in poli-sci generally, not necessarily at the core of the interest, because race is kind of not central to political science research agendas, but you cannot ignore it. because
Yes.
it is race that does the work that allows the colonial emperor and later on political elites to make sense of why we can at some point include and at other points exclude the Muslims from our political project. I'll give here two examples. I gave the example already from Benjamin von Kallay, who initially thought of the Bosnians as an Oriental race. Now, that would not make any sense the moment he would find the collaborators becoming the Reisul Ulema, right? So what they do is basically say, well, actually, the Bosnians are not an Oriental race. Only some of them who converted. But they can actually get rid of this superficial race. And how so? Because their origin is actually the Bogomil aristocracy, which is a European, based on European soil found nation. So they are actually, in that sense, white in their essence. But if they get rid of all those traditions from the Ottomans, fully embrace Habsburg modernity project, they can kind of get white again. And that's the whole rationale that they present. Similarly, you have it with the way how the Germans make sense of brown and black subjects in the colonial territories. Initially, the Arabs are seen as a problematic peoples because they were part of the resistance. Once they became the collaborators, the Arabs were elevated like in between the blacks and whites. Not fully white, obviously, but still much more elevated than the black folks. Which was also the reason for why they included them in the educational institutions at the beginning, because they were the ones who were educated, they were the ones who could be used for the bureaucratic apparatus that they established in the first decades of the colonial rule. While the blacks were seen as the half Muslims initially, which is potential collaborators against the Arab revolters, and they were not seen as fully Muslim. They were like fake Muslims, they would call them. And they used this whole French colonial idea of the black Islam as being not a full original Arab Islam. But then that again turned and was changed into black Islam being actually the militant Islam.
Excellent. Yeah, I want to come to the issue of race and racialization because, as you've said a few times, it's central to the argument. Just before that, though, I want to come back to this point. So you're saying one of the alternative lines of argument is this whole securitization focused political science, and there's a lot of that because there was a lot of funding after 9/11 all over the world to do this type of research. Um, so let's set that one aside, even though there's a lot of instructive points you've made there about that. There's another one that okay, I want to get to the race one a bit later. If we come back to Fetzer and Soper, institutional path dependency theory, that's not really about securitization, is it? That's just kind of like saying, well, there's certain institutions in Europe, and Islam comes in before you had Christian churches, and now the states are just kind of playing fair, if you will. Is that? Can you explain that theory a bit more?
Sure, absolutely. And I would not say that I contradict that theory because
Okay.
I also have this argument of institutional path dependency. But but where I differ from Fetz and Soper is that they look at how the state basically treats the dominant white churches, which is most of the time the Protestant and more so the Catholic Church, and how that kind of relationship shapes the general framework of how to go about Muslims. And they don't speak about the difference, right? That's what they are kind of overlooking in a way. Some would say that probably if they would write that book today, they would write it in a different way because other than in 2004-5, these differences have become much more overt compared to back then. But I would say I do also have a historical path dependency theory. And mine says, well, at the beginning is this whole coloniality of racialized Islampolitik that is not usual Religionspolitik, as Germans would say, or Austrians, which is like the way of how the state treats a whatever respective church or a religious denomination. So I would say theoretically, I'm not necessarily contradicting that line of explanation. I would just highlight another difference, which is that the Islampolitik has from the beginning on always been different to the general Religionspolitik. And one of the concepts that I also use for that is what other scholars have called white secularity, which is the idea that actually the white church is not only different in the sense that it is seen as racially superior to other churches and denominations, but it is part of even the secular contract, in the sense that white Christianity is part of the idea of progress as long as it accepts the secular paradigm, which the assumption is that Islam can never do.
Okay, interesting. And the other comparison with Viet Badr and their volume, that's more about how they're focusing on the colonies,
Right.
as opposed to how that translates back home.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the main arguments of a lot of the anti-colonial writers, like think about Aimé Césaire and others, have written, is that one of the things which, for instance, when Aimé Césaire speaks about the Holocaust, he says what the Germans did to the Nama and Herero in today's Namibia, committing that genocide, it's the coming home of the genocide on European soil. That's how he interprets the Holocaust. And my interpretation here is what they learned in terms of acquiring and producing the colonial knowledge about Islam in the colonial period, that what comes home in the post-war era to Germany and Austria.
Wow. Okay. All right, let's talk. Let's dive a little deeper into the whole racialization and race element, because I think maybe not academic work, but there is a pervasive assumption that we're in a post-racial world, and so because we're in a post-racial world, or a non-racial world, the comparison studying the colonial era, which was racial, with now is kind of like comparing apples and oranges. But of course, I would say the whole point of your work is to question that, and to show the continuities against that. If we think about the foregrounding of race and racialization, first of all, let's start with here. How would you give us a working definition of racialization?
Okay,
That is at
so
work in your work.
the very important, because I mean, whenever you step into a room and you ask people, 20 people, like, what do you understand with race, you will get 25 answers probably, right? So, and that's important certainly to talk about. My understanding of is the way how I use racialization or racial formation, the racial becoming of the Muslim, as Rana Junaid speaks about it, is in a very abstract form, right? Because clearly, and I'm aware of that, like, let's say the colonialists had a different understanding of even the word race, what it meant for them, in the times of like scientific enlightenment, in the times of modernity. That's different to, if you want to use that word, of the postmodern kind of era in which we are living, where the social science, more constructivist understanding of race is very, very different. So the way I use it is as a metaphor, as something that can stand for very different things at the same time. For what in the Enlightenment period people would have called biological race, but also for culture, for religion, for other things. And one of the things that I like to emphasize here is, and I know that some people might have a difficulty with that, is, the very origin of race in the 15th century, as you certainly know, is from the Spanish raja, meaning basically two things: blood and religion, having a vastly different meaning compared to how in the late 19th, early 20th century people were speaking about race. So I think this ability and this coming back also of the idea of race signifying a different religion, a different blood, a different essence. And most importantly, the way of how I use it is that racialization allows for the white male dominant power structures to differentiate to any kind of population, and it depends on ultimately only one thing: what those in power want in this very moment. And some of the things, and I think that's also one of these super interesting aspects of this comparative analysis, is with the Germans we had the brown and black colonial Muslim subjects, with the Bosnians and the Austro-Hungarians we had the white Bosnian Muslim subjects. But the whiteness of Bosnians was not always whiteness, as I have shown, right? It was an Oriental race at the point. It was, and there is this whole idea of Balkanism, from Orientalism, that the east of Europe, even up until today, look at Britain and how they think about people from Poland. Look at, like, when I grew up in the 90s in Austria, the way we spoke about Bulgarians, Romanians, and everything being part of the former Soviet Union. That was never considered fully Western European white, right? So as much as we have that kind of flexibility and fluidity in the understanding of whiteness, that's also the case for brownness and blackness. But most importantly, it is part of a crucial part of allowing to exclude and include certain populations. Let me give you a very specific example here or two. One of that I did not include in the book because it's just happened like more recently. But the first one that I included is when the right-wing far-right party in Austria, the FPÖ, published a position paper on Islam. One of their arguments was that the whole recognition of an Islamic community should not be expanded to what they called immigration Islam, but should only be confined to the Bosnians who lived under Austro-Hungarian rule in the colonial period. They don't say colonial, but I say it, right? So the idea is that the whole recognition of Islam should be confined solely to the white Bosnian Muslims, without saying it that explicitly, right? Or I'll give you another example with the AfD, the Alternative for Germany. Now, Alice Weidel, the current chairwoman of the AfD, recently, like I think a year or so ago, said in public, and a lot of right-wing politicians have done so since, also in Austria, basically trying to frame the Turkish Muslims as good people. Their argument is they are tax-paying citizens who are working and contributing to society. And they are differentiating that with the new immigrants coming from Syria and Iraq. And one of the ways of how they also frame that is these are the new immigrants are the conservative Muslims, whereas Turks can, on the one hand, also be seen as a little bit more white, one could argue, but also are part of us. Now, the whole mobilization of right-wing populist parties for the previous 3 decades was against Turkish origin Muslims in both countries, right? But this again shows you, this fluidity of racial in and out groups, and how this constant racial fluidity allows for politicians and people in power to create new boundaries of inclusion and exclusion.
Right, that's I think that's very important. So the fluid element means it doesn't have to be about race. It could be religion, it could be an element of culture, language, ethnicity, appearance even. as we know, with the case of Sikhs in the United States getting confused for being Muslims. Um, so there's a fluid element that allows the process. But if I want to think about the process itself and its kind of theoretical pillars, there's an othering, there's an in and out group, which means there's also a kind of hierarchy of superior inferior, and then there's probably some element of discriminatory treatment. And I'm just trying to get in here because at some level, people may argue that othering, at least othering to some extent, is a kind of a natural thing. So if we look at people as distinct cultures, to some extent, obviously there's fluidity at the borders, but um, if we think about different cultures, anyone inhabiting a particular culture will always be socialized to see their culture as normal, and therefore to look at others as um, to one degree or other not as normal. Which doesn't mean it's looking down at them. It just means that some element of the othering process seems to be to be natural. So, is the problem with racialization the inferiorizing element? You would say. Um, you can understand the question. Like I'm trying to think of uh, what exactly at the core of racialization is the problem per
Mhm.
se.
All
Because
right.
even so, one of the things, even like
Mhm.
differential treatment, you'll find that in Islam there is some differential treatment in, say, Islamic political thought of Muslims and non-Muslims. Some of even within Muslims, but they're tied to some substantive factor,
Mhm.
right? Muslims, for example, Muslims have to pay zakat. Non-Muslims don't have to pay zakat. They have to pay something else, right? Land taxation. So it's not because they're being looked down upon, but there is so differential treatment, othering, inferiorization. Like, what is it that actually makes racialization a
Okay.
problem?
Well, I mean, I think there is a very widespread idea that you called it otherization. I would not call it that way because, let's say, the way, for instance, Edward Said used othering in Orientalism is very close to, I think, the way how racism scholars, even though he does not speak about race in his book, basically speak about racism.
Yep.
So I think there is one thing about, like, where you differentiate between different populations. I mean, you can very easily differentiate between somebody who says, well, I belong to Christianity, I belong to Islam. That's a differentiation you make. But the moment you put some value in that in terms of creating a hierarchy of who is better or worse and
Mm-hmm.
who is up and down because of belonging to a specific group that is predefined as being superior, inferior, that's where the
Mm-hmm.
problem comes in. And that's where I think we speak about racism in a form that differs and that in a way emerged as, some decolonial scholars would say, with the very idea of how race emerged in the 15th century, uh, the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, and the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, and the beginning of an emerging idea of a white male identity, Christian identity, that differentiates to the Jewish, the Muslim, and the Black subject. That's kind of like one way of how some people would put it. And what is important here for me, and that's also part of the racial hierarchy that is created here, is that even those Muslims who are allowed in and who are seen as being part of the collaborators for the power structures, at the end of the day, are not fully recognized as
Yeah.
humans.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that's a very key aspect here. And why? Because of that kind of racial hierarchy. And this is what I can clearly see if I look into the letter exchange, the way how the dual finance minister spoke about in private, in correspondence with his governor in Sarajevo, about the collaborators. He was ridiculing
Mm.
them. They were not taken fully as humans. They were rather pawns on the chessboard, but they
Mm.
were not fully recognized as a human subject. And this is a serious problem that we have to come up, like we have to discuss why. Because if racialized Islampolitik and if the coloniality of Islampolitik is so heavily bound to the question of of a racial hierarchy, it is for the white man to overcome is exactly this issue. Some scholars like Ramon Grossvogel, who came up with this idea of epistemic racism, if that is something that we see being manifested in academia, in scholarship, in culture, politics, economics, and in all spheres of life, and the colonial scholars make exactly that argument. I have just adopted it to the very restricted area of Islampolitik in this study, but it is a much broader problem that we see. And as long as the white man is not able to overcome that idea of white superiority, and we are again living in a time where this is like, advertised very much in the public. We have make the world white again. This is what we are seeing in the slogans of the global north. So as long as this problem is not challenged, there won't be any change to that kind of a colonial order. And that is really, at the heart also a very much fundamentally underlying issue that I'm addressing here.
No, thank you very much. I think it's very important to get the understanding of racialization, to understand it, because racists in particular have difficult time understanding it. They think it's enough to say Islam is a religion, end of story. But even I find Muslims, others, even like genuine people, have difficulty. So they'll say things like, racism has this dictionary definition. Why do these decolonial scholars have to, change that around in order to make it sense? But that's just a misunderstanding of what's being said. Let me ask a different question, however, about the fundamental versus perhaps more secondary nature of racialization as an explanatory factor in the governance of Islam and the governance of just generally the way Western states treat people, treat minorities. A lot of the examples you've given also tend towards an alternative explanation, which just says that racialization is an instrument. Racism is an instrument, and the end goal is actually political control. So, for example, you said, the Germans in Africa, at one point the blacks are a problem, and then they're not a problem. At one point, the Arabs are a problem, and they're not a problem. But if it was tied to kind of race and genes, which it was at that time anyway, that wouldn't happen. So, the question, I guess, here would be: is the end goal just political control, and then you use whatever you can as instruments? Or is racialization more important than that, and not merely of instrumental value?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. I think it goes beyond the instrumental value. I think it has an instrumental value. That's how it is used. But if different civilizations, different groups of peoples are living through hundreds of years of that kind of discourse, there is a truth in it that is embodied in the minds and in the habitus, in the acts of people.
Right.
And we all know that, right? I mean, those of us who are in academia, we know that in a department of philosophy, you don't teach Ibn Khaldun as a philosopher. You will teach him in a course on non-Western philosophy. And this is how we institutionalize that kind of a racialized thinking about the world in our institutions. And that's also how the polities work. Like, when look at the Gaza genocide, right? These some of the Western governments, like Germany, for instance, like Austria, who were very much in support of a lot of what the Israelis did, and were amongst those who did not vote, and were amongst the very, very, very few countries that disdained themselves from giving a clear vote in the United Nations. that comes from a particular understanding of what is whose lives are worth as humans, right? So we can't disaggregate this whole race issue because it explains so much,
Yes.
right?
Now that's an excellent point, because I was just thinking about it. Like, we might say that the state leaders use race instrumentally, but at some level, when it becomes the DNA of the society and the way you're thinking and your worldview, then now it's just free in the society, and the people who are not making policy, but they're very much looking towards other groups in this way, and so it becomes so much more fundamental. And you can't just take your hat off whenever
Yeah,
you want. It will take a long period of subject formation and education, and I think that's a
absolutely.
very good
And
point.
it's becoming even like in a way an unconscious episteme. And I think that is where the problem is also coming from, because for a lot of people, they don't even see what they are doing, you know?
Yes, yes,
And that's why James Baldwin in the 60s, when he said when he was asked, like, what do you think about the N problem, referring to black people in the United States, he said, there is no N problem, there is only a white problem. Sorry, James Wright said that, who predecessed him like 40 years or in that quote. But also James Baldwin in a similar context said, you know, to solve the end problem, there is no end problem in the first place. The white people have to see what their problem is in order to change that condition. And I mean, that's an overarching, I think, emphasis on any kind of decolonial efforts, which I think makes it also so important for us to understand that we are still living in times of coloniality, not in times of colonialism as formal institutions, even though you could still speak about some of the formations as neo-colonial in terms of how financial dependence, economic dependence,
yes,
political dependence are still continuing to this day. But it is way beyond that and much more fundamental in what we have to overcome. And you as Ummatics, I mean, you're dealing with a lot of Islamic knowledge. A lot of the Islamic knowledge production has to be contextualized in the project of modernity and coloniality, where a lot of the scholars were again and again, the good ones, the bad ones, all of them referencing at the end of the day to this colonial order.
yes,
And trying to respond to it or to overcome it, even though sometimes with epistemic, modern, colonial patterns of thought. So this issue is much more fundamental as we want to think, and it becomes one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking about your point about the curricula in university, which are reflective of a way of thinking. In fact, it's only been in recent years, maybe last 20, 30, 40 years, that you now have, for example, history of philosophy. Peter started called history of philosophy. Standard curriculum has all these gaps, and it's just Western history of philosophy without the Western bit, because that's just kind of natural. But what I was thinking was that's across the board. Even in history, you get ancient history and modern history, and then in the middle of it, there's this massive gap that is apparently not important. But when this point is kind of recognized, and then you talk about decolonizing the curriculum, there's this massive backlash. Right? This was a major thing of the people who then come standing out to defend Western civilization, and that's right now. I'm talking. This is a reaction you're getting in the 21st century. So I think you're right to say that it's actually quite fundamental. All right, we have about half an hour. I want to ask some questions from maybe a different perspective, more kind of like an Ummatic frame, and see from a number of angles. The first question I would ask is that a recurring move that you document in the book is the state insisting that religious authority be domestically produced and domestically loyal. And you gave a number of examples of this previously. For example, severing Bosnian Muslims from the Ottoman Caliph in 1909. Germany's later turn from embassy Islam to homegrown imams. And of course, the 2015 Austrian Islam Act banning foreign funding. So there does seem to be what we might say, like from an ummatic perspective, from perspective of Umma, this reads like a sustained European project of severing Muslims in Europe from the Ummah as a structure of religious and political reference. Is that a fair characterization that you think comes out of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is even more understandable if you contrast this to what I call the usual common non-racialized Religionspolitik, which is like, think about, some of the very dominant churches, the Catholic Church, the Vatican.
Mm-hmm.
Never ever would the Austrian government think about cutting ties
Right.
between the
Yes.
Vatican and the Catholic Church in Austria.
Mm.
Or, we have Mormons
Mm.
around since 1955 in Austria, and the Mormons are not told that Utah cannot pay for their missionaries and stuff like
Mm.
that. So just to give a few examples, which I think, further explain what the difference is here that we're talking about. Because one of the arguments that you will meet when people, and I had actually one German origin student at Columbia when I was presenting the book. She said, like, but isn't the problem with foreign financing that these are not religious institutions but states? And she was referring to the to the Turkish Ministry of Religious Authorities, the Diyanet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you could make a fair point, right? You don't want the state interference into the religious work of another country. Yeah, that would be a strong argument. But the problem is really that this kind of argument does not differentiate between states and non-state actors. So it's a writ large sort of argument that
Mm.
is brought forward by the Austrian and German governments. The German government only discussed that the Austrians kind of sold it as if they would have implemented it, although not fully. But at least that was the argument. So and yes, I think the question of, and in a way that also should remind people who are very much into the history of Germany and Austria with anti-Semitism. The whole allegation vis-a-vis the Jews was not only that Judaism was not a religion but a political religion. It was also that the allegiance of Jews was global. And we are witnessing something very similar here with the Muslims, right? There is obviously, in the times of of colonialism, the Ottoman Empire existed, so there was a symbolic power that represented Islam. Now it is no more, but there's still this idea that Muslims are kind of like globalists that might have been sounding good in the 90s and the early 2000s, but not anymore these days.
Yeah.
So it is seen as a threat. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that.
Yeah. And perhaps even the good Muslim, bad Muslim approach of managing or disciplining Muslim communities often tracks precisely the line between Muslims who accept a confined, depoliticized, nationally domesticated role and those who maintain or assert ummatic commitments. The more political, the more active, solidarity with Muslims, interested in Palestine and Gaza. They recognize transnational religious authority, which again I think is just would affirm that same point again, that there's something broader here that these policies are trying to target. If let's move to a slightly, just for one question, to the prescriptive register, which may not be what your work intends to do because it's empirical, it's descriptive. You're trying to understand how things work, but if I can lean on Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, the point would be for that to lean into some type of change, some type of work. How might Muslims in Europe process this knowledge, and how should it reflect in how they live and in how they are active? How should it shape their activism? What would they do about it? So we now know what you're telling us. These are colonial policies, X, Y, Z. What can we do?
I think that's a brilliant and very important aspect,
It's
which
your
I
next book.
obviously I don't, I don't make those kinds of conclusions, but my hope is at least many of the assumptions that Muslims in Austria and Germany, and maybe also to an extent in Bosnia, and I don't know about Tanzania, Togo, Cameroon, might come up with is, first of all, to critically engage with the history itself, aside from the present.
Mm.
Because I gave you this example, like, a lot of times, when I was an undergrad student at the University of Vienna, I took some law classes by very prominent scholars of law and religion. And in the context of the Islam Law Act of 1912, one of the words that I heard for the first time was a reference to the Bosnian Muslims as European autochthonous Muslims. I didn't know what that meant at that time, and I largely took it as a descriptive term, basically meaning Muslims have been living on European soil. That's it. But with that lens that I just acquired with studying and writing this book and material, I can't but unsee the racial dimension of what was said here. When I see Bosnian Muslim elites across all of Europe, with the office in Brussels and the work that they do as a Reisul Ulema and the Bosnian Islamic religious community, I see a lot of, that kind of racial identification as white European Muslims, which I think is an illusion at the end of the day, but is used to gain the support of different constituencies within the Muslim community and used by them to progress in whatever political projects that they have. Now, I think, and I speak a lot about, especially in the chapters on the post-war era, about what is happening these days. What is happening on an institutional level with a lot of the Muslim communities, how they're organizing themselves, what they are doing or not doing against those policies. And, similar to what you said, when in the Muslim community, I think, especially I would say so for the continental Europeans, for the organized Muslims who are creating Muslim institutions, etc. I think more of a sense of what that means could trigger a lot of different fundamental questions as to their behavior vis-a-vis state institutions. I think one of the big lessons to be learned but that's my own personal take, is what the Bosnian Muslims were actually, to some extent, achieving in their struggle for religious and educational autonomy, is autonomy itself. That might, depending on what ear my voices are reaching here, might sound like, why do Muslims want to have autonomy? Well, the thing is, if you look into any kind of religious institution, especially in the secular regimes of Austria and Germany, the autonomy is what is there for the Catholic and Protestant churches. They have full autonomy of defining what they teach, how they teach it, what people they have, etc., etc. Like in those institutions that are funded by the state and those that are built on their own. And I think that is extremely important, to have this epistemic independence and nurture epistemic independence in a framework where you are free and not always depending on state institutions that interfere into defining the agenda, what you should even think and talk about. So that for me is one of, I think, the key aspects that I believe is very important. But more in general, I think also, if you understand as a Muslim in those countries and beyond, that the issue of coloniality and the racialized governance is what challenges our very existence. You will also understand that this is not only confined to Muslims, but this is a problem of a lot of racialized populations. And this is the moment where you start understanding that as a political project, the project should be overcoming and decolonizing the current state of the art, which then invites you into creating alliances with all other kinds of groups of people who are facing the same challenge, which would then inform a political project that goes way beyond Muslimness and goes into a future that should be built on much more justice for all.
Okay, excellent. No, you're right. I think there's a number of things we can learn. But it's also important, as you said, to just understand the history, the present, before we can learn how that may reflect in our activism or our work. And I would echo your points about independence. We've had very similar experiences here in Australia in dealing with the government. But of course, one of the limitations is you also have to interact with the state. There's a lot of funding made available. Some of it's beneficial, some of it has strings attached. So the whole maintaining independence becomes a balancing act and a difficult one, but a very important objective, nevertheless. I had another question about, and this is important. This is also relevant to the point you just made about other. It's not just not something that affects Muslims. There are other racialized communities facing a similar problem. It's a broader problem, and at some level, there needs to be work for solidarity in a larger project. From a knowledge perspective, from a theoretical perspective, you draw heavily on decolonial theory. Many other Muslims also do. There's a lot of good work, critical Muslim studies, Salman Sayed, and many others. A lot of this work, a lot of the coloniality, decolonial work, Quijano, Mignolo, Fanon, are developed within secular frameworks, sometimes Marxist inflected, sometimes Latin American, sometimes Black Atlantic intellectual traditions, all of which have a lot of insights to offer, no doubt. But at the same time, one of the debates within Islamic or Ummatic circles of knowledge production is how to benefit from these paradigms, but also how not to, how they need translation and critique at the same time. Because end of the day, they do come out of a secular paradigm that therefore means that there will be various elements of them that don't quite line up for our own purposes. But you also need to work with them. You need to be activist with them. And so it becomes a challenge. So the question here would be, where do you see productive alignment between decolonial theory and, say, Islamic or Ummadi critique of European power? And where, if anywhere, do you see tension or divergence as well? For example, with decolonial theories related to secularism, or its silences about Islam as a normative tradition rather than just a racialized identity. I know the book's not on this work, but these are questions that kind of naturally come up as you engage and as you build on this. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, unfortunately, I'm not engaging enough with those traditions, coming from Islam, in the sense that I'm not an Islamic studies person in a narrow sense, right? I do care about Muslims. I'm Muslim myself, right? But probably that is a work that has to be done, by a collective. Let me just say one thing here, because that has at least always been, as a layman, and I'm speaking now not as somebody who has expertise in the very question that you raised, but as a layman, my understanding was always that wherever knowledge comes from and wherever knowledge is based, you seek it. You try to understand and evolve with any kind of knowledge. And even that what we consider to be Islamic knowledge. I mean, I've written one book on the history of Islamic political thought, and you can clearly see, I mean, it has a very clear Greek mark from the beginning on, in the way how Muslim scholars have been thinking about, different concepts of politics.
Yes.
It's always entangled with other systems of
Yes.
knowledge, with other traditions. So I don't know to what extent. I mean, when I called for epistemic independence, I think yes, that is a huge part of that challenge and job is on the side of people who study Islam, right? But at the very same time, I see that also as a collective effort, in the sense that studying Islam only makes sense if you study the reality. I see myself as somebody who studies reality, right? I study as a political scientist, as a sociologist, as a social scientist. I study the world in which we live. And that can only be, part of a communicative, dialectic process in which we try to find answers to our solutions to the questions that we are raising, that for us are important. So rather than, emphasizing, and I'm sure there are tensions, like in every kind of conversation that we're going to have, will always be tensions and conflicts and contradictions, and that's part of the whole process. But I would rather emphasize actually the productive aspect of all of that, right? Rather than, hypothetical emphasis on the tensions first and foremost, because assuming that the vast majority of the world, as the global south, if you want to call it that way, is suffering under these conditions, should bring us to the very conclusion that what we should try to understand is, how can we get out of that? And if that is our leading question in our inquiry and in our strategizing after that, we should then not be super focused on possible tensions, but rather with how can we overcome the very current state of the art.
Okay. Just the last question. I know you have to go. You got an appointment soon. Just the last question, and perhaps we can end on a more positive note. Going back to the point about resistance, Muslim resistance and agency. Because sometimes when you paint the empirical descriptive picture, it can look very difficult, particularly with the modern state. The modern state has a lot of power; it's very invasive. If we look at your point about dialectical relationship and Muslim agency with Islampolitik, the Bosnian uprisings, the refusals of co-optation, do you see a continuity on that side as well, that side of the ledger? So obviously there's state policies. Is there a ummatic thread of resistance that runs parallel to the colonial to post-colonial continuity of governance, or has that resistance been more episodic and disconnected? How would you capture
I would
briefly
not see any kind, if Ummatic is here, meaning the international, I do not see any kind of international confrontation with that. Rather the opposite. I see rather national state responses that oftentimes, and actually starting in the colonial era with the Ottomans, there is a great study on how the Ottomans, tried to get most out of it when Bosnia was basically given over to the Habsburg monarchy. And I see rather very specific interests at stake that inform the different responses. But let me say one thing. I think here we come to another much more fundamental question, which is the question about power, right? If the power structures are first and foremost interested in gaining control over Muslim subjects because they treat them as a potential threat, the response practically speaking, might be to gain power as well, to have more agency, to expand one's room of how to shape the future. But there is also, I think, in terms of the whole idea of what power stands for and is as a product of modernity and Western political thinking, something that, again, from my lay perspective as a Muslim, is actually not central, maybe even to what we think is important. And might sound in some ears a little bit defeatist, but that it's not what I want to say. I think resistance is always important, and I think I also manifest that in the way of how I have spoken out against the Austrian government. But you could argue that maybe strategically it was not right because it led to nothing, which I don't agree with. But because I think from our Muslim perspective, what is important is the struggle itself. First and foremost, much more important than the outcome, which is very much not the Western way of thinking about it from a very positivist epistemic standpoint. And therefore, even when I show and outline what I have studied here, this is in no way saying there is no way forward or is very pessimistic. I would not even frame it that way. Rather, I say this is a realistic way of how we should look at things if we really want to change it, and not only on the superficial level try to make some new amendments in order to give it a nicer outlook. So yeah, going back, I think the struggle is what is the essence. That's what Ali Izetbegovic said in Islam Between East and West, in his very last sentence, when he said, submission, your name is Islam. This is what it is all about. And it's not about, and that's already, the way of how we think about power, etc. We can see how much the political thought of the current state of the art is also involving our understanding, or is impacting our understanding.
Excellent. Well, I think that's an excellent note to end on. Of course, there's a lot of topics there that require a lot more discussion, particularly the prescriptive and power and what Muslims can do and what they ought to do. But that's not the subject of this book. And at least, we're going to see each other in Sarajevo, which is a very apt context and geographical location and cultural of significance. So we can talk about these in person and with others that are there. Everyone else who's going to watch this is going to miss out, of course, unless you're also coming to the conference, inshallah. But otherwise, I think we are out of time. This has been a fascinating conversation, I think. A lot of great questions and a lot of great talking points to think further on. I wish you well in whatever your next project is, and we can talk about that as well when we meet. But we'll end here for today.
Thank you so much.
And, I think it's been a good discussion. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. And Assalamu alaikum to Dr. Farid. Thank you very much, and to everyone else watching this broadcast.
All right. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
All right. Thanks so much. That was a good conversation.
Thank you. Enjoy.